Hello and welcome to the Russell Investments Suitability webinar. I'm Mark Hayhoe and I'm from Russell Investments, and today I'm joined by Damien Davis from TimeBank. Damien has got extensive experience in supporting advisors with suitability and client reporting, and he's going to share his experience today with us on this webinar. It's been an exceptional quarter of volatility, and one thing that doesn't go away is the need to report to clients and give them a suitability report. Clients may be feeling quite anxious, and part of the job must be at the moment to try and protect them from themselves. So, question starting off for Damien is, Damien, how do advisors protect clients from themselves?
Well, it's a crazy time. There's no doubt about it. I mean, when you think about the start of this year and everything that's kind of happened, it's not a surprise that I think really at the moment, clients are going to look to their advisor for real leadership. I think the phrase that you use there is protecting clients from themselves. And that makes a lot of sense because, you know, if you look at everything that's going on from a client's perspective, it's quite easy to understand how they may want to make knee-jerk reactions to things. You know, they've seen changes in the markets. I'm not an investment expert by any means, but I know that, you know, the idea is that clients, you know, if they see panic in the market and they see, you know, values falling, they may think that this is the time to get out. And of course, potentially it's the worst thing to do. So yeah, you're absolutely right. I think what advisors can be doing now is helping clients understand the context of where they are now in relation to their wider kind of plan and objectives. I think that's the most important thing that advisors can do. You know, add a bit of confidence to the client right now, and just sort of let them know that, you know, whilst there may be things going on at the moment that are kind of scary, what impact does that actually have on the long-term journey, if you know what I mean? So, you know, there'll be clients and advisors that work quite closely on cash flow planning and things like that. And of course, you know, that's a great way to kind of create a snapshot as to where a client is on that journey and what impact and what actions they may need to take or may not need to take. And of course, if not every client has had a cash flow produced, this notion of, you know, regular suitability, this is a great chance to actually start to consider implementing those sorts of things, because it'll just give clients that context to what they're actually doing, I think. And I think I saw a presentation a little while back from you guys where it was talking about exactly that, you know, the client behavior, protecting clients from themselves. And I think, like I said, if advisors can use this as a chance to really give strong, you know, kind of trusted advisor, critical friend, that sort of, you know, that leadership role, I think that's the most important thing right now, really.
Sure. So in a nutshell, Damien, this is a long journey rather than a bit of a short-term deviation from what the client's trying to do.
Yeah. And everyone's on a different journey at the end of the day. You know, the relationships advisors have with their clients, they're at different stages in that journey. So that's where that individual suitability comes in, and that's the bit that clients are really going to value.
Sure. And I remember last year and obviously into this year as well, we're still hearing a lot about MiFID II. How does that all fit in with MiFID II and what was involved in that bit of legislation?
Yeah, I mean, MiFID II is one of those things that when it kind of came about, it was, there felt like there was a bit of, I don't know, it's sort of like a fatigued acceptance to this new bit of legislation. If you think how recently it came about after RDR and the massive changes that RDR brought to a lot of businesses, so I can kind of understand how, you know, it's kind of come about. But the one thing that, interestingly, there was quite a lot of resistance for, which I think is actually really, really powerful for advisors, was this notion of periodic suitability. So I've actually got some slides that I can kind of put up if you like.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. The idea was that you know, with MiFID II, what was being introduced was the idea that, look, if you're charging a regular fee for a regular service, then you've got to deliver that regular service, and that involves regular suitability. So one of the things that a lot of people kind of, you know, built when RDR came about was this notion of an ongoing fee model. And of course, what MiFID II has said is if you've got this ongoing fee model, you've now got to really deliver that service. And you've got to prove that you're delivering it. That's the most important thing. But ultimately, where I think this is really valuable for a lot of advisors is that the rules around the periodic suitability weren't just saying you need to provide suitability for recommendations you're making to clients for new investments. It's also about stuff that they should hold. So if you're recommending a client makes no changes to their recommendations, you've actually got to put that in the context of the wider suitability. So that's understanding their circumstances, understanding what they're trying to achieve, and helping them understand that what they have is actually going to kind of get them there. And the other most important thing, and I think this is an interesting thing, again, just to try and help advisors engender a bit of loyalty with clients, is the fact that one of the new parts of COBS that came out off the back of MiFID was COBS 9A. And one of the things that it said in terms of the actual time scale that these things need to be done is that the data the advisor's using to base those recommendations on, in other words, the fact find, has to be up to date. And that was something that when pre-MiFID, there wasn't really timescales about how up to date data needs to be. So yeah, those are the big kind of three changes that have really sort of come about off the back of MiFID. And like I said, I think that's a really good opportunity for advisors now to kind of rebase the relationship. So whilst they have to do these reviews and whilst they have to deliver the MiFID periodic suitability report, it's a brilliant opportunity to just rekindle that relationship with those clients and like I say, kind of generate that loyalty. Just let them see that you're proactive rather than
sure. So in a nutshell, what you seem to be saying is it's a great time for advisors to demonstrate their value and actually refresh their understanding of what the client's objectives are.
That's exactly it, and this is where a lot of the tools that we use as sort of financial advisors and financial planners really come into their own, because clients will be reacting to the news that they're hearing. The market's down and this, that, and the other, but in their mind it's an absolute, whereas the advisor knows that it's a relative. That the markets might be down and your investments might be down, but actually when we actually put these bits and pieces in place at the start of the relationship, we looked at how much risk you could actually take, and we looked at what sort of loss you could actually bear in relation to these investments, and actually everything's okay. So yes, it's not great news, but don't panic. I think that's the most important thing about it. That's that value.
Sure. And that value, and I guess it's also putting the whole journey in the context of what the advisor is helping the client to achieve, those objectives.
That's exactly it. Yeah, and objectives is one of those things. It's quite easy. It's quite a big temptation to try and standardize objectives. But I think the way that advisors can protect themselves most of all is actually create real, use the client's own wording in terms of what they're talking about, in terms of the objectives that the clients are trying to achieve, really.
And can you give us an example of that, Damien, that you've seen in your experience of working with suitability reports and reporting to clients? Yeah.
Well, I think the temptation can be, because we as a profession and an industry deal with things day in and day out, and we get quite familiar with things. We get familiar with abbreviations. We get familiar with our language. And clients, they all come from different worlds. So you might have a senior mechanical engineer in a factory, and then the next day you may be speaking to a drama teacher. I think the temptation is to translate what a client says into our language. So using objectives in the client's own words. Examples of that might be, if you are a drama teacher, and you're not going to be able to express as mechanically what it is that you're trying to achieve. It's a bit more loose and a bit more flowery. Whereas if you are a mechanical engineer, you've probably got a distinct and a determined outlook of what those objectives are. And I think for the advisor, the temptation, try and avoid the temptation to translate that into a unified set of objectives, because aside from anything else, one of the things the regulator doesn't like to see is the same objectives over and over again in client files. So if they're ever looking at client files, they see the same objective in more than one file, that it can sort of trigger alarm bells that they want to look a little bit deeper. So yeah, that's probably a good example of what I'd suggest.
Sure. So I'm guessing they would be the type of things like leave an inheritance to their children, or have a cruise when they retire,
Yeah,
or have a certain level of income
yeah,
at a certain stage in their retirement,
yeah.
and looking at how they would phase their retirement income in.
And I think that's the skill of the advisor, isn't it? Understanding what it is that the client's sort of expressing as an objective, but actually
Yeah,
working out how to implement that at a sort of a more, you know, the sort of tactical level, if you like. The objective is the strategy, and then how you
sure.
apply that is the tactics that the advisor kind of puts together as their plan, basically.
Yeah, and I guess in some ways it's actually translating what the client's actually saying in and helping them clarify their own objectives.
And just translating it is right. Translating it into a sense that they can kind of commit to it as well. So it's not changing
Sure.
the essence of what they're saying, but more helping kind of nail it down, distilling it, putting it into a really clear.
Yeah. And so in a nutshell, how would you describe suitability?
So suitability, well, I've got some more slides actually. Suitability, interestingly, it's one of those things that
Yeah.
it's there are definitions, very clear definitions of what suitability actually means, and it's outlined in two sections of COBS actually, which I know COBS isn't one of those things that you're really going to want to spend a lot of time reading necessarily, unless you can't get to sleep at night. But the beauty of reading it is that you're really familiar with it. And the two sections are, the first section would be COBS 9.2. So COBS 9.2 basically deals with what's called assessing suitability. So that's fact finding in our kind of common parlance, if you like. And that's the stuff that involved, you know, when people talk about fact finds, it's quite easy to talk about the hardcore, you know, dates of birth and all the rest of it, but it involves quite simplistic stuff as well, just understanding clients' investment experiences, you know, kind of putting it together. And then that links with COBS 9.4. So COBS 9.4 are the suitability reports. And that's quite clearly defined as well as to what a suitability report actually is. But those two things are suitability. And interestingly for me, I say interesting for me, I do apologize. I run a power planning business. So, you know, interesting for me might be different to interesting for other people. But what I find interesting about those two things is that there's a huge overlap. So they're not really things that I'd suggest people necessarily worry about in isolation. But what needs to be in a report is actually kind of reflective of what an IFA or an advisor needs to do in terms of fact finding. So there's actually 4 things that the regulator says needs to be in a report. They've got to specify the client's demands and needs. That's the objectives. And then they've got to explain what they're actually recommending. Once they explain what they're recommending, there's 2 parts they need to add to that. Any disadvantages that might come about off the back of it, and also why it actually is going to achieve those objectives. And those 2 things are kind of like, it's like the balance, if you like. It's the 2 ends of the fulcrum. You know, here's what you want to achieve. Here's how we recommend it's achieved. But you need to be aware of these potential risks, these potential downsides. There is another section which says that you need to give the client such details as are appropriate to the complexity of the transaction. Nice, snappy phrase. The thing with that's probably more relevant for an initial recommendation. So the first time you meet a client and you put a proper report together. I think for the interim suitability reports, unless you're recommending something completely different to the client, you can actually take that bit out, because that's the compliance department's sort of favorite bit. That's where they get really kind of carried away. And actually, if you're telling a client they need to hold what they've got rather than, you know, take something new, you're really kind of, all you're doing is emphasizing the things that you probably recommended at the start, and you're just making sure that it still matches their needs. So yeah, so those are the basic contents that a suitability report needs to have. So, you know, it doesn't need to be too hardcore, actually.
Sure. And Damien, you know, speaking to people and reading the trade press, we seem to be getting a lot of myths about suitability. Can you just run through some of those and maybe bust them for us?
Yeah, by all means. It's my favorite. It's my favorite pastime, if I'm honest. It's fascinating for us. So, like I said, I run a paraplanning business, and we work with a lot of different firms who operate within a lot of different compliance regimes, ecosystems. And it's quite interesting that, the first question that we get asked is your work compliant? And the answer is, well, there isn't really any such thing as compliant. And this is where a lot of the firms develop their own sort of culture around compliance, which can deviate quite a lot with what's actually expected in terms of the regulations. But I think there's two. I've got a few more slides again. I think there's two parts to the myth busting that I think might be quite useful. The first is actually around the simplicity that I think that there actually is in terms of suitability. When you look at COBS 9.2 and COBS 9.4, it's interesting that the actual requirements are quite straightforward. So a fact find, COBS 9.2, you've got to find those things out. And then COBS 9.4, the suitability report, you're actually expressing back to the client what you found at the start. And those things is probably the first myth that I would bust, the fact that a suitability report needs to take forever. Because if you plan a fact-finding meeting really well, you can actually write 75% of your suitability report there and then. So you've got to understand the client's investment experience, and in the suitability report, you've got to explain the risks involved in the transaction. Well, that's the same thing, essentially. You have to find out the client's financial situation in the fact find, and then in the suitability report, you've got to explain how they can actually bear the investment risks that you're recommending. And then you've got to understand their objectives and show them how it meets it. So all of those three things, when you think about it, if you plan a review meeting or a fact-finding meeting well, you can actually write most of the suitability report at that time. And of course, that's all then neatly sort of wound together with the periodic suitability reports. But I think a few of the myths, there's a few things that I see which I recommend people avoid. The first is reasons why not. You see this quite a lot where, clients are being recommended one thing, and then the advisor spends an awful lot of time saying why they're not recommending a whole bunch of other stuff. If you think about when you go to the doctor, they'll make a prescription for something and they'll explain why, but they won't necessarily explain why they haven't decided to amputate your leg or something like that. So that's the first one. The next one is no discernible benefit. This is a really tricky one. This is where you've got no control over, for example, investment performance. You might be recommending a client take something that's more expensive. Now, those things, you need to avoid recommending things that you've got no control over. If something's more expensive, that's fine, as long as the client gets a value that's commensurate with the additional cost. So yeah, creating advice and no discernible benefit is a really important thing. Avoid generic text. The problem with generic text is it's quite alienating. So padding out, we see reports padded out with huge, bits of information about, what a SIP is and how it works and how annual allowance works, when actually all that's being recommended is an ISA. It's just kind of, it doesn't draw the client in, it sort of alienates them. Creating loads of jargon and waffle. Jargon, I mean, this industry is littered with it, sadly. It's one of those things. Again, you think of all the different types of clients that you're going to be dealing with, trying to avoid any kind of alienation is really important. And the last one is Franklin's Gambit. Now, the regulator refers to Franklin's Gambit as retrofitting. So in other words, you're going into a piece of advice with the assumption that the client's going to get an outcome that you've predetermined. And this is where centralized investment propositions come into their own. If you've got a really well-designed document for centralized investment propositions, and remember, centralized investment propositions aren't the outcome. It's not necessarily you guys, Russell Investments. What it is the process that the advisor goes through to determine that you're the best outcome. That process needs to be documented. And if you don't have that, then the regulator and the ombudsman can accuse you of going into recommendations with a predetermined outcome. And then just flipping that stuff that I think is really good and stuff that I sort of recommend our clients sort of take into their reports, creating real objectives. We've spoken about earlier, Mark, the notion that,
sure.
Clients' own words, that's really, really important. And also defining how those objectives are actually going to be achieved. So you use the idea of, passing on an estate to the kids with, as little inheritance tax as possible. Well, brilliant. How is that actually going to be achieved, and what impact is it going to have? The third one, which is is an elegant summary. I think that's just a really good way, particularly with periodic suitability. If you think you've got a client at the moment who is a bit jittery, and they say, "Listen, Mark, I trust you. You're our advisor, but I'm a bit anxious." If you create an elegant summary, that's something that they can refer to quite regularly. So if they're feeling jittery, they can go, "Okay, no, Mark, yeah, that made sense because Mark's outlined it quite elegantly there on a single page." So that's really useful.
Sure.
The fourth one, graphics. We designed so that the idea of a suitability report is it's like a 50-page Word document. Around about 4 or 5 years ago, we went through an exercise of designing. So we've got a division that we call Skunkworks. It's based on that, like the Boeing. I think it was Boeing had like a division where you kind of geek out on ideas, and so we had a bunch of people sit down and say, well, if we were going to redesign suitability reports, what would it actually look like? And it was a completely interactive document, all graphics, a few numbers, but those numbers were in the form of infographics. And it was a beautiful, outcome in terms of what the client could actually do. Now, of course, with everything that's gone on recently and everyone working remotely and doing, sort of Zoom meetings with our clients and all the rest of it, actually, I think that the time's come where you can actually start to reevaluate how you deliver suitability to clients. It doesn't necessarily have to be a Word document. The rules that the regulator lays down is that it has to be transmitted in a durable medium. That's the only rule. It doesn't say it has to be a bound document or an email. It just has to be a durable medium. So in other words, something people can refer to later on. So yeah, that's a big one. And I think the last sort of recommendation is that idea of reviewing suitability. Make it, instead of it being something you have to do, if you switch emphasis and actually make it the focus of the relationship, I think it's what will create a much more loyal client. The notion that this is what we recommended, and every year we're just going to make sure it's still working. I think that's probably the really clean way to do it.
Sure. And for those advisors who have just now in the process of collecting up their performance reports and getting ready to do the client review for the first quarter, what would your message to them be, Damien?
So I think there's a number of things that they can do. I mean, if you proactively engage with clients, I think we've been through, I don't know. Like I say, I'm not an investment expert, but it feels like we've been through the worst. So hopefully that communication process has already begun. But if it hasn't, really, engage with actually speaking to clients actively and proactively. And like I say, look at the reviews as a genuine benefit. It's not necessarily a hassle. And I think the most important takeaway is the fact that clients like spending time with advisors. I've got another graphic just to show you. This is a bit of research. Years ago, this was produced. I can't remember the company that did it, but they looked at the amount of time that an advisor spent doing the various different parts of the financial advice, financial planning process, and compared it to the value that the clients actually put on that part of the process. Now, historically, if you look at it, the research, selecting solutions, producing reports, all of those sorts of things, they take a lot of time, but it's the bit the client doesn't value. The bit the client values is the bit, where they're actually spending a bit of time with the advisor. They're actually talking to them, talking about the progress and sort of creating waypoints of a journey, I think. So it's not, I think the most important takeaway is, by all means, talk to clients, do all the things that you need to do, but don't do it because you have to do it. Do it because the client wants you to do it. And I think you should be able to get a lot more business out of people, I think.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you, Damien. That was really informative, and you've busted some myths there on suitability. You've really highlighted it as a way of an opportunity of highlighting the value that advisors bring. So thank you for that.
And that's just my last point. What you said there, highlighting the value that advisors bring. When you look at the value, you can genuinely put a pounds and pence figure on the value
Sure.
that an advisor has to the client. It's an enormous value, and it shouldn't be underplayed. So yeah, definitely.
Thank you. Really insightful, Damien. If you enjoyed this webinar and would like some more information, please feel free to contact Damien, or alternatively, your usual Russell Investments contact, or on our website. There's lots of resource available, which will support you in your conversations with clients during these times and your suitability reports. I thank you for your time, and stay safe.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you. Cheers, Mark.